Good evening and welcome to the Harry Ainley Evening News. Today's topic, India. Currently, there is much change and growth occurring within this country. Change and growth that has and will continue to affect us all. To get a better perspective on this radical change, today we will be looking into India's history, specifically the Raj period. For insight on this complex time, we go now to our Indian history expert, Silas Kwok. Silas?
Thanks, Andy. Now, the Raj period was really a turning point in India's history. It began in 1858, when the government of Britain enacted the Government of India Act, which shifted control of India from the East India Company to the British Crown. Essentially, the British Crown assumed complete control of all of India. This was a dramatic change for a country that had been ruled by the East India Trading Company for over a century. Change came soon. In 1905, the Crown elected Lord Minto to the position of Viceroy of India. Along with Secretary of State John Morley, the two enacted various reforms via the Councils Act of 1909. This created more Indian representation in provincial government. It also created separate Hindu and Muslim electorates. This served to help the British agenda of dividing up India. The reforms did, however, grant Indians a place within the administration of their country. By the time 1920 had come around, many Indian politicians were becoming increasingly unsatisfied with the current British rule, which had become even more oppressive over time. The nationalist ideas had also spread through many parts of the country, with many Indians wanting to overthrow the British rule of India. Around this time, a man known as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi began his campaign of civil disobedience against the British Crown. Fortunately, an enlightened man, Gandhi realized that the best way to overthrow the British government was through peaceful civil protest. He realized this would lead to the least violence and produce the most safest transition. Over the next few years, Gandhi led a series of nonviolent protests against the British Raj, which involved boycotting various British policies, organizing peaceful protests, and campaigning for India's political sovereignty. However, in 1922, Gandhi was arrested due to inflammatory statements made in his paper, Young India, for speaking out against British wrongdoings. Gandhi was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Through this time, without his lead, the Indian National Congress began to splinter into two factions, Hindu and Muslim. Relations began to also deteriorate. In 1928, the British government appointed a new Constitutional Reform Commission to look into the complaints of Indians. This commission, however, did not include any Indian representatives. In response, Indian political parties boycotted the commission. Gandhi, having served his sentence, helped forward a resolution that called for British government to grant India Dominion status or be faced with a new campaign of non-cooperation. In 1930, India raised its new flag and declared its independence in protest of British rule. This civil disobedience continued through the years, culminating in the Salt March led by Gandhi in protest on the British tax on salt. These events eventually pressured the British government to release all its political prisoners in exchange for the suspension of the civil disobedience movement. When World War II broke out in 1939, Gandhi declared that India would not fight in a war for freedom and that freedom was not allowed for India itself. As the war continued, more and more people began to call for India's immediate independence. As a result of these calls, what would be later known as the Quit India movement was launched in 1942. This widespread campaign of civil disobedience was aimed at bringing the British government to negotiations. Around this time, India was experiencing a famine as well. This only served to fuel anti-Crown sentiments. Finally, in 1947, Britain found itself unable to sustain its administration over India due to the immense cost of the war and large-scale public unrest. In the end, Britain dissolved the British Raj and portioned off areas of the Muslim majority to what later became known as Pakistan. At 12:02 a.m., August 5, 1947, India became independent.
Thank you, Silas, for the exhaustive examination of the Raj period. Now, as you imagine, 175 years of British rule does not leave a country overnight. To examine some of the legacies of the Raj, we go now to our legacy aficionado, Morgan Redshaw.
Thanks, Andy. Now, there are a number of legacies left behind by British rule in India. While some are certainly beneficial, others have sadly hurt India. One example of a positive, though, was the parliamentary system, which brought democracy to India. Another was the fact that many Indian tribes, formerly in conflict, united to protest British rule. This unification has brought peace to India, peace that might otherwise have taken much longer to develop. There are, however, many negative legacies as well. For one, the British oppression of the Indian textile industry has severely stunted native Indian fashions and led to a more westernized fashion scene. Also, the British's former thorough exploitation of India's natural resources led to a slower start for India's new government. The debilitating economic ramifications of this exploitation have no doubt long delayed the kind of growth India is just now starting to experience. Other important legacies include the proliferation of the English language in India, the spread of Christianity, and the introduction of English architectural ideas.
Thanks, Morgan. Now that you've heard a fair account of India's history and how it's affected them, now we go to our Rage correspondent, Harley, for an editorial on the Raj period. Harley?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So you want my opinion on the Raj period. You want to know if I think it positively affected India? Well, here's your answer in 4 words. No, 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 no.
The Raj period was, at the time, an unprecedented example of the negative effects of globalization. There was poverty, corruption, and famine, all caused by the British and their greed. Apparently for them, controlling an entire foreign country wasn't enough. They had to run the economy into the ground to stop competition with the homeland. That's a little bit like buying a competing company and then laying off all the workers and closing the buildings. Sound like a bad idea? It is. But the British were clearly uninterested in what the local savages thought. They just went on their merry way, leaving the indigenous people poor, hungry, and unrepresented in government. On top of that, they considered any criticism of their regime criminal. Case in point, Mohandas Gandhi, imprisoned for 2 years for writing an anti-British paper. And even then, the British made no concessions. It took the whole of India protesting for over 30 years for the British to wake up and realize the situation was unsustainable, that they weren't wanted. It took 18 days for Egypt to oust their power-hungry president. That means it took 608 times longer for the British to leave power than it did for their modern-day Egyptian counterparts. To sum it up, the British had absolutely no right to waltz in and just seize control of India. They thought they ruled the world because of their education, their culture, and their prized Christianity. I'm sorry, but when you start randomly conquering places, that's not education, that's ignorance. And ignorance of ethics is no excuse.
Thanks for that clear statement on our perspective on this issue. Well, that's all for now. We hope you've enjoyed or at least tolerated this podcast. Good night.